Welcome, everyone, to another episode of IT Visionaries, and today we have a special guest. His name is Rich Nanda. He is the U.S. Monitor Deloitte Practice Leader. Rich, welcome to the show.
Albert, thanks for having me.
All right, that was a mouthful, what I just said. So I think we all know that Deloitte is just a massive company with massive lines of business. Sometimes when people think about Deloitte, they can't even begin to put their finger on what it is that they do. But we got to try. So U.S. Monitor, Deloitte, Practice Leader. What does that mean? What exactly do you do at Deloitte, and what does your organization do?
Yeah, so I'm lucky to lead the strategy business within Deloitte's U.S. practice. So we're a global professional services firm. The largest part of our business is consulting, and so that spans strategy, implementation, lots of technology work. But we also, of course, have an accounting, a tax, and a risk advisory business as well. And we're all over the world. So while I'm the U.S. practice leader in strategy, I work with my colleagues, in every corner of the world as a matter of routine. And look, our breadth, the fact that we can serve a client's needs, regardless of how they're changing and transforming their business, is our strength. So we're really proud of the fact that that we have scale and breadth in our services.
That's awesome. And then specifically for your, laser in, if you could, for us, what is it that your division or your group works on?
Yeah, so we have a unique combination of classic corporate and competitive strategy work. So think about, companies looking to understand, what markets should they play in, how do they fortify their competitive advantages, and how they play in those markets. We also have a transformation practice, so business model transformation, capability transformation. So clients figure out how they want to change. We help them then design and implement those changes. And we also have a tech strategy practice, so focused on how technology leaders adopt new technologies into the organization, how they work with their business colleagues to make sure that all of that tech spend is put towards growth and competing differently. So it's a pretty unique combination of strategy businesses, and we love the fact that not only are we the big thinkers that help our clients wrestle with complicated problems, but we're there with them on the journey as they implement those.
Yeah. So give us an idea of some of the big, questions that are being asked of your organization right now, because the one thing that we know that's a lot different from Deloitte and some of our other guests that have been on the show, some of our guests, when they talk about strategy, usually some type of short-term strategy. Maybe it can be, hey, how do I better monitor analytics going through my cloud services?
Yeah.
How do I better handle disaster backup and mitigation? How do I handle short-term security, things like that? You guys, and the way I described Deloitte, the way you guys work to people that ask me questions about it, is that you guys are trying to open up, in my opinion, new lines of business or transform completely the way something is done. I noticed that you have a background in motor vehicles, and I was thinking just like all these internal combustion engine companies are now thinking, hey, how do we open up our lines of EVs, which is going to be drastically different from what they've ever done before. Is that the type of, so given that, that type of huge wholesale business foundational, we're going to go into new categories type thinking, I think you guys work on. What are some of the major questions or problem sets that are getting asked of Deloitte today?
Yeah, Albert. I think the nature of client questions is getting bigger and more existential, which is exciting for us as consultants. It can be intimidating for some of our clients, but I think executives that are embracing the moment, those executives are likely to be better off than those that are, trying to make their problems and opportunities smaller in nature. You talked about automotive. Look, the things that Mary Barra and GM are doing to kind of declare that they're a software company, that electrification of vehicles is going to happen, and they're going to drive that change. And as they become electrified, as vehicles become software platforms, they're going to make money, in many other ways besides just selling the cars that get us from point A to point B. There's all kinds of services right, that they believe they can layer onto a software enabled vehicle. And I think that future's coming. So, and every big player in every industry vertical has a version of that question that's ahead of them. And so while strategy and kind of how companies compete has always been a fun place to play, I would say we're seeing seismic shifts now and for the next decade, maybe two, in terms of value chains getting shook up, the way companies make money and engage their customers changing fundamentally. And that's all because of the digitization of our economy. And we're in the first inning. We've got a long way to go before we see all of the implications of a more digital economy.
The way you describe that, I can see how a lot of people that are listening to IT Visionaries might get super excited by that. I always joke that I'm like not the typical audience member of IT Visionaries because I don't like paying for subscription services. I don't like recurring billing of anything. And one of the internet handles I follow on Twitter is called the Internet of Shit, where it's like every device or product is going to have a SaaS component to it, or nothing will work. So that scares me a little bit. But how do you and your team think about these questions and demands on your team? Because like you said, the breadth of customer at Deloitte is quite large, from automotive to snacks, food manufacturers. It's weird to think about all these things that are traditionally physical. You know what I mean? Like, can a mug company go digital? I don't know. Can a snack company go digital? It begs that question. There's a lot of things in the past that have been, that didn't have a digital layer, and you're saying everyone wants to figure out a digital layer to their business. How do you guys approach thinking how these markets and categories and opportunities will open?
Well, look, first you got to start with the end customer, right? And so, we and many others, the design thinking wave that's here that starts with end users and customers is very powerful. Right. And so any company, right, that's looking to grow, make money differently, it starts with, well, who's going to buy products and services from us? What are their needs? How do we shape those needs, into the future? And so, having a very customer centric starting point is essential. But then from that point, and this is what makes this day and age so exciting, is there's way more possibilities about how you could access, service, and retain those customers than ever before. And that's because we as consumers in a digital world, our habits are not what they were 5 to 10 years ago. You talked about subscription services, like those are thriving because we're watching Squid Game and telling all our friends how great it is, right? And more people are subscribing to Netflix, and we're not watching broadcast television. And so at the end of the day, all these businesses are born out of new customer behaviors. And so it starts with really deep appreciation of the customer. And you have to have sector specificity around that. Like you can't, we need strategy practitioners that deeply understand the dynamics in a given sector, because serving a patient in healthcare and life sciences is very different than serving, somebody who wants, the next show to binge watch. But having said that, what's really interesting is, not only is sector depth important, but there's so much outside in disruption now, particularly from the tech companies, that you can't be blinded by what in your sector. And so it's this really interesting combination of sector expertise with some outside in thinking about kind of the trends and likely disruption that's coming from outside of a given, known value chain.
And for our audience, can you share your sector? What would you consider your sector expertise?
Yeah. So I grew up in automotive, but that was way back when, 20 years ago. I started my career at GM, which isn't why I plug Mary and GM. I really like what they're doing. But as a consultant, I focused on consumer products. So I work with CPG manufacturers and retailers.
So what are some of the things that you have, because you said, you got to start with customer, because every strategy is going to be based upon taking, advantage or optimizing how a customer is going to want to behave in the next, let's say, decade or 2 decades or something like that. What are some of the observations you and your team have made that are fundamentally shifting? Because, you know, when you're going through it, as in living it, you know, a lot of people probably can't pinpoint that their behavior is starting to change or their attitudes towards something has changed. It's usually like, okay, a decade has passed and you look back like, I can't believe they used to do things like that, right? And it happens quickly. The jump, or I guess it's the same as how people describe your children growing up, right? The days are long, the years are short. You look back on the years like, oh, how did that happen so fast? What are some things that you and your team are starting to notice about consumers when it comes to CPGs? How are we fundamentally changing, or how are we subtly changing that you think is going to be a fundamental shift in like the next decade?
Well, I think what's happened is there's aspects of our life that, you know, the bar is now super high, right? We want things on demand. We want them just for us. You know, and on the one hand, we don't like giving up our, you know, our privacy and our information. But what we've noticed is we like when, you know, the platform companies we buy from and we connect with our family on, you know, give us content that's just for us, right? And so I think the bar is now set. And when you get in your car in the future, you know, you're gonna want it to be intelligent about, you know, where you are in the day and where you might be going and what your needs are. I think a really interesting parallel to this is how healthcare needs to be transformed and delivered. And we as patients kind of suffer through a pretty shitty set of experiences.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of good is going to come from healthcare getting smarter about, you know, where our bodies are and where our minds are, what we need, getting those, you know, medical services in a much more seamless and frictionless way. We're going to be healthier for it. And all these healthcare problems we have, that's how they're going to be transformed. We're going to become a healthier nation at a lower cost as data, AI, right, get adopted into healthcare just as they have in, you know, entertainment and other parts of the economy.
Where do you see like some of the biggest near-term shifts happening in that regard? Because like as I've said on multiple episodes in the past, my background is I went to University of Emory or Emory University as they like to call it, very snooty school. Don't go there. Got a degree in behavior science and public health, and so I've always been fascinated by disease prevention. Of course, there's not as much money in prevention as there is in taking care of the illness, and one of the things that you just mentioned is something that I've been tracking quite closely with potential smart devices, whether it's toilets, whether it's monitors, watches, things that are able to basically tell you that, hey, you're heading down the path of illness well before illness. What are some of the things you see in the near-term future that are going to become available? Because I know you guys are working on some pretty amazing projects probably that like would get the, you know, our audience psyched up.
Look, I think, you know, what you're alluding to there, wearables, smart homes, like all of that's coming and will be an essential data signal, right, into our health and well-being. The immediate to do, and look, that innovation is going to happen. I'm wearing a Whoop strap here that I've had on my wrist for over a year now without taking off. That's going to keep happening. But the immediate thing that healthcare players have to do is they're sitting on a trove of data already, right? And in most cases, that data doesn't talk to doesn't talk to itself within an organization, let alone across organizations. And so there's a big foundational cleanup that's required, which is just getting all of that data smarter, more intelligent, more interoperable is the word to just say that can it talk to each other. A really interesting example from some research we did is Anthem. And they have a chief digital officer, Rajiv Ronanki. And a few years ago, you know, Rajiv saw that, look, we're not just going to be a provider of information that helps doctors and health systems connect with patients in a transactional way and get their bills paid. But if we actually kind of digitize all this data that we have, we automate it, we put some AI against it, we're going to have intelligence about how this system works and what patients need and how doctors can help those patients more. And sure enough, during the pandemic, there was this big issue where people that needed care weren't going to hospitals because they were worried about the virus, right? And in the spring of last year, even into the summer of last year.
I think we were almost recommended not to go too, because every day the news would report, hey, overcapacity, too many patients. Like it was probably discouraging if you had an ailment or illness. You're like, hey, I don't want to be
exactly right. It was, people, they didn't have great information and they were afraid. But what Anthem was able to do is they were able to send nudges to patients to say, hey, you're overdue for this care. It's actually safe to go to this facility to go get it, or there's telemedicine available. Please kind of consult your doctor over Zoom. And it was a huge success story in the pandemic, and all the result of a few years ago, that organization understanding that there was a digital future in which they needed to get all of that data working for them a little bit more. It was this asset that was sitting on their books and they weren't doing anything with it. And under Rajiv's leadership, they made a lot of progress, and a real world example during the pandemic of, embracing that future and serving patients better for it.
You mentioned that ability to do so. Let me back up my statement. So you mentioned like there was a foundational problem that they had to unpack all this data, make it, as you suggested, more interoperable. And that was just to create something that we already have experienced in other tools, a nudge, right? Other tools already have nudge capabilities, and we're as a society very used to notifications. In a way, notifications have completely transformed human behavior. It's one of those things that we talked about where it's like when you're living it, you don't recognize it. But now I think we've created a society that doesn't really function too well without it, right? Like we as individuals, without a cell phone alert. My wife, by the way, is one of those people that still uses a physical calendar. And so I never know what's going on. So
Same. My wife uses a paper and I can't get her to switch, and it's tough.
Yeah, she says like, oh, you forgot about, my son's practice. I'm like, well, it's not on my calendar. I don't see it. It's like, it is on the calendar. I'm like, come on, I'm not in front of that piece of paper. But like that's kind of like what we were talking about before. Like over a short period of time, you don't really notice it's happening, but that has happened. What are some of the things that and that to me seems relatively obvious, but it's shocking, kind of, I guess, the way systems were set up for the company, that they couldn't make something obvious available until, like you said, Rajiv really took a look at it and said, wow, we got to do this. How many instances of that do you think there are? Like how many companies, it's hard to say, of course, you don't work with every single company, but how many companies would you say, or industries that are like, that just need to move forward, or that you would strongly encourage to move forward? Because on one hand, the way you describe it, it's like, yeah, that's clearly obvious. But then on the other hand, like when I think about it, it's like, man, like why wasn't this available earlier? Nudging and notifications has been around since BlackBerry days. So that's early 2000s when we would get the alerts like, hey, something's happening.
Look, I think, like I said, we're in the first inning. And I think the vast majority of the business world is, still yet to be fully digitized, and is still living their best analog selves, right? and so there's just going to be a golden era of change ahead. And yeah, I think 90%, right, of companies still, right, have to truly kind of embrace digital transformation to change themselves. And nudging is one example. Like you can go through every sector, of the economy and companies out there, and automation, kind of intelligent nudging, like these things they're just being adopted for the first time, let alone like universally and in ways that like truly move the needle.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about it. I remember the first time I got in a vehicle with a tire air pressure sensor. It was like something so obvious, like, oh, okay, yeah, like I'd like to know that my air pressure is low. And then but it did take, like you suggest, it took years before that technology was available. And I believe it's standard now, but I'm sure there's still manufacturers that make it without it. I can't think of like not having that. When you mentioned before digital transformation, and that's a word that's used a lot, right? And you just recently wrote a book on it. You are the author of The Transformational Myth, Leading Your Organization Through Uncertain Times. You wrote this book with a couple other authors, Gerald Kane, Wynn Phillips, and Jonathan Kapulski. Hopefully I pronounced
Yeah.
everybody's name wrong. Correctly.
Yeah.
Hopefully I pronounced everyone's name correctly. We took a look at a couple excerpts, and you call it, it's a good catchy title, The Transformation Myth. Looks like it just got released. What is the myth for our audience? What is the myth surrounding transformation?
Yeah.
You guys hit on.
Thanks for letting me talk about the book a little bit. So the myth is that transformation is this one and done project or event. And when in fact, the best companies are continuously transforming themselves. And in a more uncertain world where change is continuous and frankly technological innovation is faster than it's ever been before, you just have to expect that you're going to be continuously adapting to that environment, continuously making big changes to the company, and that the steady state really isn't all that steady. And so that's the premise of the book. We wrote it over the course of 2020, and we used the events of the pandemic and all the derivative disruptions from the pandemic to kind of study companies that were responding well and that weren't, and drew some lessons of that very acute disruption of the pandemic to say, okay, in a more disruptive world where companies are going to have chronic overlapping disruptions, what kind of leadership traits, organizational traits matter to help thrive in that environment.
And one of the things that you do, and I want you to dive into this growth mindset among leaders, because we took a look at you and the team call it the phenomenon of fixed growth mindset and versus I guess continuous growth, right? And you have these charts. I'm taking a look at this in like charts, and it really does take an idea of looking out over decades. So what is the problem, I guess, with fixed? Give our audience an example.
Yeah.
This concept of a fixed mindset.
We draw a contrast between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And this isn't a new kind of business or academic concept, but overlaying it onto managing disruption, seeing disruption as an opportunity versus a problem that has to be solved. Why do some companies see disruption as an opportunity versus others see it as a threat? And it does come down to a leadership mindset that is more growth oriented. And so we have tried and unpack what that growth mindset means to harnessing disruption. And leaders, that have a growth mindset, they tend to be more willing to experiment. They tend to be more willing to partner with non-traditional players. They tend to allow failure in the organization, knowing that all innovation is going to lead to some failures.
Yep.
And they permeate that kind of culturally, right? So they don't just talk the talk, but they back it up with how they act, how they reward people. And companies with the fixed mindset, they tend to just say, okay, we got to optimize for a short-term horizon. We're going to set up our management structure, right, to optimize against that short-term horizon. And then what tends to happen is those companies get left behind in this fast-moving, increasingly digital economy.
But this concept goes into all aspects of business, right? It doesn't have to deal with digitization. It could be, because like one of the things I saw recently is this really cool case study on like why is Chick-fil-A makes so much more money than other QSRs, and it's like there's this like unrelenting focus. I guess it's some technology in there,
for sure,
but like to serve the customer, right?
Yeah,
like how they handle drive-throughs. I don't know if you've ever been through a Chick-fil-A drive-through line, but it's substantially faster than any other restaurant. Is that kind of like where I guess the best leaders, the best companies, the fastest growing companies how are they doing? They're basically, you mentioned earlier, like they're looking at the customer behavior. Is that what they're doing? Is like looking at every single customer, I guess, choke point or dissatisfaction arena and be like, hey, how do we solve that and usually technology is part of the solution, not the whole solution, but it's a part of it.
Yeah.
Is that like kind of the mindset? Like you don't have to fundamentally transform your whole business, but it's just constantly pulling up, like up leveling aspects of your business.
Yeah.
Is that part of it?
That's what totally well said, Albert. Look, at the end of the day, Chick-fil-A is going to make money by selling, delicious chicken sandwiches. And the minute their chicken sandwiches aren't delicious anymore, they're in trouble, right? So in that context, their digital transformation is all about, what are the other elements of the customer experience? You talked about kind of speed and convenience. Yeah. And I guarantee there's a whole bunch of automation, that has gone into them being able to do that better than others, whether that's automation of, how the restaurant works and keeping it smooth. It's automation of, the AV equipment and, how they're seeing when a customer is coming through the drive-through and being alerted, things like that. And so, the fundamentals of that business, delicious chicken isn't going to change, but, differentiating themselves, continuing to attract customers, there's absolutely an acknowledgement of a more digital world with consumer expectations, as we've described, and them having to adopt technology to meet that. And it's an important part of our what we tell clients, and which is also in the book, is it's never about the technology, right? But at the end of the day, we're in an increasingly technological world. And, if you don't understand the implications of that technology and how it makes your business better or potentially better, then you'll be left behind. So it's not about the technology, but technology is essential to how companies compete today.
How do you think, or why do you think certain CEOs or leaders or companies seem more willing to take these risks, especially when given the capital requirements, right? So, it's one thing for a lot of our clients that we're software-based companies is like, oh, you can sign a SaaS contract and you can try it out. But like a lot of things, like we just said with Chick-fil-A or other businesses, it requires investment in hardware. Like you have to invest in the machines, you have to invest capital, human capital, training. I think we always hear of like the bad stories on the news of like CEOs not willing to invest in people, but then there are the ones in this growth mindset that are constantly investing, I guess, everywhere. Do you find that companies that are in what would you say? Like, what is their reaction when it usually requires some type of CapEx on top of software that they have to invest in? Are they just as willing to do it, the people with growth mindsets, or is that like the distinguishing line between someone who's like, they say they're about growth, but actually you might not have a growth mindset? Because if you're not willing to invest in the tools or the tooling to make your operation better, then you're really not there yet. You're more focused on maybe your short-term solution, like people thinking like, oh, just some software will help the whole problem.
Yeah, look, by the way, if this was easy, right, every CEO would be doing it. So it's absolutely, tough to pull off. And for sure, it's going to stress a company's P&L and balance sheet on the investment, required to make these significant, changes in their business. But the best companies, right, they're taking the long view. So they're understanding that, again, transformation is not a one and done, and we have to kind of create the capacity to invest in change over time. So how do we create room in our financials and in the P&L to do that? And you can't go from 0 to 60 right away, right? So you got to start by starting, and then build the kind of the financial affordability, the human capital affordability, the risk affordability, into the business operations over time. The companies that are getting it wrong are the ones that will say, look, I have 12 months. This is what we can put into it. And then, we have to be at that end state in 12 to 24 months or whatever. And so, that's a fixed mindset, right? That's seeing finish lines as destinations, rather than as, future building blocks.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then the other thing we're starting to see is, and we've noticed just the research team at IT Visionaries, is this adjacent but different acquisition model that seems to be happening, like where companies are really thinking outside the box. Like I know, for example, one of the major golf brands acquired Top Golf, which is like an entertainment complex. Like that's was unheard of, right? We saw Lululemon acquiring Mirror. Like when they do the acquisition, like, oh, I can see like, oh, exercise and clothes that fits, golf and golf that fits, but it's not in the same vertical. Usually they're like an adjacent vertical. Talk about that. Is that how a lot of the biggest companies are going to grow into new lines of business? Or do you think they're just going to acquire these lines of business and be like, hey, this is our new thing? Because when the Top Golf thing went down, I was surprised because I never heard of any of the golf brands acquiring. Like they're typically not in that space. They make equipment. They make equipment as like, oh, they would make stores. They would make a store. But here they are, I believe Callaway acquiring Top Golf. Like those don't, I mean, Top Golf's arguably not even golf. You know what I mean? Like you're just smashing.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever played. You're just smashing a ball in the giant like pits, right?
Yeah.
How do you these companies that are doing that to open new categories? Is that like their mindset? Like, hey, we're going to innovate so fast that we're just going outside of our lane. That's
Right.
how we're going to do it.
I see kind of two questions in there. One is like, will companies expand out of their traditional lane, into new markets to grow and acquire customers, in a different way? And the Top Golf example is a really good one of that, which is, are we a more interesting company if we're serving the same or similar consumers, in multiple aspects of their life? And every company is going to have a set of decisions or choices ahead of them about how broad, they want their competitive arena to be. And several will conclude that actually moving into adjacencies makes sense, because our competitive advantages travel well into those adjacencies. Some companies, and by the way, those are calculated bets, and they'll be right sometimes and they'll be wrong sometimes. But for sure, we're going to see an environment of companies broadening their where to play choices, as we like to say in the strategy world. And then there's a build or buy decision, right? Do we build our way into that, or do we just go the M&A route? And for sure, over the next handful of years, we're going to see a lot of M&A. Balance sheets are healthy. There's a lot of capital out there to borrow. And M&A will be a very attractive way to access markets or capabilities to get into markets, that wasn't there before. And the last thing I'll say is a more digital economy makes those adjacent spaces that much more interesting. So, go back to the General Motors example. Yeah. A car that is software, they had OnStar 20 years ago, right? So software in the car is not a new thing, but software in the car in a connected world, now that's interesting, because when you're driving around and you want to buy something, maybe GM is the next commerce platform, right? That is connecting people, or maybe they, will get into insurance, or maybe there'll be another version of Uber, who knows? But software in a car in a connected world is a lot different than OnStar was 20 years ago.
Yeah, it can become a content play. I can't tell you how many times I've driven with my son. He's like, oh, we want to eat something. And it's like, it's very difficult to know what's in front of you or what's en route without, pulling up Google Maps and searching and possibly killing yourself. So don't do that, everybody. If this new connected cars can give us this information, that'd be killer. Yeah, when I think of the way you describe, right, the digitization of everything and how consumers, I'm curious. I'm like wildly fascinated by what companies are going to pick up adjacencies versus like inside their own vertical. I think right now the conversation right now is PayPal is going to in talks to acquire Pinterest, which is something they've never done before. They've always acquired other financial companies. They've acquired like Venmo, right? Makes total sense. That's money transacting, but to get a social media platform, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years as companies with, like you said, healthy balance sheets think to like, how do we broaden our markets? Super fascinating time and place. Rich, I want to thank you for joining us today on IT Visionaries, sharing some of the things you think and also some of the things that your company's working on. But before you go, it is time for the lightning round. The lightning round is brought to you by Salesforce Platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Rich, this is where we ask you questions outside of the world of work so our audience can get to know you a little better. You ready?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. On your Twitter bio, it says that you occasionally whine. What does that mean?
It means I love wine to the point of, we got to have a bottle with, with a good meal. I like traveling to wine country. I like
Oh,
meeting the people that make, the wines that I enjoy. And I probably buy and collect a little too much wine, than I need, but it's a fun hobby.
there you go. Well, give us a recommendation. What is a wine that you think is close to the top of your list that everyone should give a try?
Well, without a doubt, the best wine in the world is Burgundy. So that's Pinot and Chardonnay from France. And an affordable option is Chablis. So beautiful white Burgundy. It's the best Chardonnay in the world.
Listen to that. I don't know anything about wine, but I will take your recommendation because my wife is a wine drinker. There you go.
Okay.
You've just written a book. For those who are thinking about writing their own book, whether it's fiction or your case happens to be research based, so we'll go with nonfiction business book. Let me ask you a question. How long did the process take? I know you were with the team, but how long did that process take?
We started writing in March of 2020. We submitted our manuscript right around this time last year, so end of October. So the research and the writing took 7 months or so. And then it's an academic book we wrote with some professors. So there's some academic peer reviews that happen that takes, another couple of months. And then from there, it's a pretty extensive cycle of, just nuts and bolts of publishing, getting the page layouts right and the graphics right. And then there's a whole host of supply chain issues to kind of get the books primed and ready to go. We launched in September 28th, the book launched. So all in all, it was a year and a half from concept to books on shelves.
Now, this will tell us whether the process was painful or easy. Would you write another one?
For sure, I'd write another one. It was a fun process. Having co-authors helps. Writing it during a pandemic when I didn't have anything to do on the weekends. We were all at home and locked down. So, plenty of time to focus on writing. But it was a great process. Always fun to see, your hard work in black and white.
All right. So when you're not enjoying wine and when you're not writing books, what do you like to do for fun?
I'm a sports junkie. I'm here in Chicago. So I love to watch my teams, the Cubs, tough year. The Bears, they just got thumped by Brady yesterday, tough year. The Blackhawks are off to a rough start, but the Bulls are showing promise. We got a good, fun, young team. So hopefully they provide me some joy this year while the other teams are a little down.
How long have you lived in Chicago?
I was born here. So I've spent my life in Chicago or the Chicago area. I did a stint in Michigan for undergrad and a stint in New York for grad school, but otherwise Chicago's been home.
Listen, everyone, do not feel bad for Rich at all. That means he grew up during the Bulls dynasty. He got to cheer for the hometown greatest player of all time. So let's not feel bad for Rich. The Blackhawks won 3 cups in 6 years. So, I mean, come on, man. We can't feel bad for you. So a little down year is not a big deal.
And we had the Cubs in 2016. So
there you go. Your Cubbies
right,
they broke the curse. You got to live that.
Yeah.
People have literally not seen it in their lifetimes, and you got to see it in your lifetime. So I think that you've had a pretty good run of being a sports fan.
All right, I'll try and keep a growth mindset and look at the bright side of Chicago sports.
There it is. Rich, I want to thank you for joining us today on IT Visionaries. Thanks for sharing some of the things you're up to at Deloitte. And then I think we have to close with one more question. And this will be a little bit aligned with your work plus the lightning round. What is a product that or a company that you just think is just getting it right? Like you just love everything they're doing and you think the innovation is just killer. Now you named GM earlier, but so I want you to name something else.
All right. So maybe near and dear to my heart, Peloton. So like many people over the pandemic, the gym shut down and I kind of got into home fitness, got my Peloton over the summer, and I love the platform. The bike is excellent technology and, works well, but they're doing an awesome job on their other content. Now they're getting into merchandise in a pretty big way. So I find Peloton to be a pretty fascinating company and one that, I tend to spend multiple hours per week immersed in.
Were you a Beachbody person prior?
No, I wasn't. I was not a Beachbody person.
So I cannot find a single person yet. This is my quest, because I know Beachbody cares. Is why is Peloton's content and routines better than Beachbody? Because Beachbody was first subscription, subscription exercise routines over the apps and stuff like that, and Peloton just raced past them. It's pretty fascinating. So I've yet to meet that person that can quantify it. But I know Beachbody cares. They have to care. They're like, how is this company doing it?
I'll be on the lookout, Albert.
Rich, thanks for joining us today on IT Visionaries. It was a lot of fun having you.
All right. I enjoyed being here. Thank you.